So I'm talking about, well, the average distance between stars is such and such, and we've got this expanding universe. And it's like, how do you know? How do you measure how far away in all these light years that these stars are? It's a great question. So I didn't know the answer, so I said I would look it up. And unfortunately, I kind of as I dug into this, I can tell you that the math is really complex. At the University of Connecticut, after I went through calculus, I took the next step because I've always taken math in my entire life. I always had some kind of a math class. And so after going through honors calculus, I got to the next step, which was differential equations. And I was halfway through my class, and it was really hard. I mean, it's a really hard next step. And I was halfway through the semester, and I majored in molecular biology. And I said to myself, oh my gosh, this is an elective. I don't have to do this. And it was the last math class that I took as a college, at the college level. So I looked at this here, and I started looking at the math that's involved, and it's way above my pay grade. So this is for you. But anyway, when they measure interstellar distances, they use 4 different techniques, and sometimes they have to use one and another, and they have to combine these different techniques. But the major one is this technique called...
Can you move your music, Steve?
Oh, sorry. Hey, Joe, while I'm going over this, would you connect me? And I'm going to be on this presentation. So the first one is parallax, and there might be... there is, in fact, 2 L's in parallax. And the math behind this, you know, there's those pieces of art that use parallax, and you look at the painting or the print or the graphic, and it looks like a bunch of repetitive little small things on this whole thing. But if you look at it and you stare at it for like 5 minutes, there's this effect that's called parallax, where your eyes begin to get a focal point that's a few inches in front of this thing, and all of a sudden this 3-dimensional view comes into place, and this very intricate, detailed scene is there. Have you ever seen those things? That's parallax. Okay, and the science of that parallax is how they measure stars that are in far away distances. Variable stars, there are some stars that are near each other that, for example, may rotate in an orbit around each other. So sometimes as you look up at these stars, when they're lined up just right, you only see one star. And then when they are to the side, you now see it as a different size. It may look like one star, but it changes in size because it's 2 stars that are far away. And you can actually take the change in size with the proper size big telescope, and you can estimate the distance away by the change in the size, and knowing the angle of arc and the change in size, you can tell how far away this thing is. Also color. So stars all look kind of white to us, but if you're looking at them very carefully with telescopes, they emit different colors, and you can actually get an idea of the temperature of the stars and do some calculations and estimations of distance based on the color of the stars. And finally, the knowledge of the expanding universe can also be used, because the farther something is away, the greater that red shift, and you can estimate distances by looking at the degree of that red shift. And so these are the 4 different methods that astrologers use to measure the distance of stars. Okay, and that's about as detailed as I can get, because, like I said, math is way above my head. So today we are continuing on the cosmological, the teleological argument, and I'm really hoping this works.
Had technologic problems for the last week.
Okay, so we completed last week the cosmological argument, the argument from beginnings. Everything that came into existence has a cause. The universe had a beginning. Therefore, the universe has a cause. That's it in a nutshell. We spent 2 weeks just to say that. Now, the design argument is called the teleological argument. And to do this, we have to take a step back and take a look at what it is that we're going to do to look at this argument by design. And I wanted to ask the question, what is science? We are going to use science to take a look at the universe in the same way that we look at anything from the past and try to determine what its origins are. Okay? So science is this intellectual or practical activity that encompasses the systematic study of structure and behavior of the physical and natural world through observation and experiment. We observe, we note, we repeat it, we experiment with it, and we try to determine cause. We determine cause and effect, and we try to understand the physical and natural world through this kind of systematic observation. And just as an illustration, I want to take a look at artifacts. In the field of archaeology, you're sifting through and you find something, and you have to determine whether this thing was naturally made or if in fact it was an artifact. An artifact is defined as an object that's been intentionally made. There is an intelligence behind it with a purpose, produced for a certain purpose. And to discern that, we have to figure out how to assess intention and purpose. Well, you do that by looking at the object. For example, if you come across this thing right here and you study it, you're going to see that this thing is kind of symmetrically shaped, comes to a point. You look and you see what appears to be little chisel marks creating a serrated edge. It's got all kinds of features to it, such as a very straight and squared off section at the bottom that looks like it could be inserted into something. And you would look at this thing and you would say, well, there's complexity in this particular item. There's symmetry in this item. There are markings on it that do not come from natural mechanisms. We don't see straight lines and this type of natural work on a particular object. It has sharp pointed edges and serrations that looks like it is for poking and cutting. And we would conclude that this is a man-made object in your little artifact field, that this was not just a rock that natural forces worked on. Or if you came across this thing here, you would look and analyze this thing and look at its particular shape. You could see a kind of groove in the rock that something could be tied to around in this area. You could study the bottoms of this to look at what kind of forces were acting on this thing, and you could determine that this was also something that was made with a purpose. This looks like an ancient hammer. So when we are looking at something like an artifact and trying to determine whether it is natural or whether it was designed, we use a science for that. We use this systematic observation. And what we're looking for is complexity and specificity. Complexity refers to the complexity of the object, and specificity is referring to the purpose of the object. This is, I want to note, the same process that archaeologists use to determine if an object is natural or man-made, and it's the same type of analysis that's used for SETI. SETI is the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. So this here is a picture of what's called the Allen Array in California, and this is the home of SETI, where they scan the cosmos looking for signs and signals of intelligent life. Now, many of you may have seen the movie Contact. Who's seen that movie? Okay, so half of us have seen it. In Contact, they're sitting there monitoring these big giant telescopes here that are pointed out into outer space, receiving signals, and all of a sudden they get a set of numbers coming in. 2, 3, 5, 7, 11, 13, 17, 19, 23, 29, 31. And immediately, Jodie Foster gets all excited and she says, we've got contact from outer space. Now, why would she say that? This is the interactive part. Why would she say that?
Yeah, front row. Yeah, it's because you're getting information now. It's not just random.
So, what information are you getting from this?
It's a known set of prime numbers.
Okay, so if all of a sudden, from outer space, we get beamed a series of numbers, and they were specifically prime numbers, we can infer from that that there is this complexity and purpose. The purpose being that there is a set of specific numbers that are only prime numbers. Okay? It takes an intelligence to separate prime numbers from non-prime numbers. That is an intelligent process that goes into that. And so if you start getting these numbers beamed down to you from outer space, there's something behind that. Okay? That's why Jodie Foster got all excited, and so on went the movie. So now we are going to put ourselves into the scientist role, and we're going to practice. So you're walking along the beach with your significant other, and you come across this beautiful scene in the sand. Now, tell me what you think about this here. What do you see?
Squeezing in really late.
No worries. So tell me what you see in this.
Either duck prints or stones that the water has rushed up and then dragged the stones across the shore. One of them.
Okay, so what we see is kind of angled arcs, and we see these kind of grooves in the sand. And I'll ask you, in your observations at lakes and oceans and in sands, has anybody seen patterns like this before? Yeah. Water rushes by and it cuts little channels into the sand, and this is absolutely something that we see happening today by natural processes and causes. What if you came across this? What do you think about that?
It's like 3 trees.
Could be water, like an erosion pattern.
It could be. It's like, well, now there's a little bit more symmetry to it, and there's this branching process. The branches have just straight lines, kind of ferny looking. And if somebody said, well, did somebody make that, or did nature cause it? You know, it's kind of a hard call, but we've seen water causing erosion in sand that goes in patterns from narrower to deeper channels. And so we would look at that and say, well, that's kind of interesting because there's similarities to trees and to organic stuff, but we've seen natural processes cause stuff like that through our systematic observation. What about this here? We're getting a little bit more complex, but same thing. We've seen that when water rushes past a little rock, that the little eddy currents that occurs carves out these little deeper wells. Okay, same thing. We've got things that look like trunks and stems, but still everything's just kind of a straight line. So we've got some increasing complexity, but still we don't see a specificity or a purpose. Now, you're walking down the sand and you see this. Now all of a sudden, there's something very different. We see petals of a flower. We see stamen. We see leaves with veins. We see this very symmetric and, we begin to see purpose. We begin to see design put into it, okay? in the natural world, we do not usually see the forces of nature causing things with such specific purpose, intention, and design in it. We saw things that kind of look like trees. Well, this is kind of an organic thing. But nobody would look at this and now say, well, the wind and the waves and the water, but that, and besides that, there's a message. It says, Jessica, will you be my light at the bottom?
Must have been an explosion.
So then you're walking along the beach, and there's nobody that would look at this structure and think that the water and the waves made this. The intentions, there's specificity in here where you see Betty Boop with her lips, and you see a sea turtle, and then you can see the skyline of New York City with Radio City Music Hall and an Empire State Building made out of sand. Or perhaps this sandcastle here.
Good grief.
Or for Lightning McQueen fans, nobody. Besides that, you see the artist actually working on this one, so then there would be no doubt as to whether the forces of nature made this or not. And so I want to go back then, just to nail this down, so that nobody doubts the science behind our analysis. Okay, what is science? Science is really the search for causes, and there are two types of causes. There are non-intelligent natural causes, and there are intelligent causes. Let's take a look then, just like we did with our little sand shapes at the Grand Canyon. Here at the Grand Canyon, we can witness today the forces of rushing water, cutting out canyons, and the type of shapes. If anybody's been to the Badlands, you can see this where you get it's very dry, and you get flash floods, and these flash floods cut into the ground, and you get these really interesting patterns that look very much like the way that this has been eroded and cut into here. We observe these things happening today, so when we look at something ancient that we can't see the cause of, like the Grand Canyon, we can infer that what we see causing these things today caused them at some unseen known time in the past. But what if you came across this mountain? Well, we watched as people got up there on the mountain and started chiseling away a few decades ago. And we watched this come to fruition. And we see in this mountain in South Dakota, we see the face of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and Theodore Roosevelt and Abraham Lincoln. And so there are two types of causes. There are natural causes. There are intelligent causes. Okay? We apply the same science to determine whether something was an intelligent cause or a natural cause. So when we're then looking at something with an unknown, far distant past, we have no idea, we didn't witness the people up there chiseling stuff, we can look at something like this ancient Buddha carved into the mountains, and we ask ourselves, what caused an unseen past event? Well, we apply the same science. Today, we see the forces carving Mount Rushmore, and we know that it was an intelligent group that had people that designed this mountain. Then there was, hundreds and hundreds of people that carved this mountain. There was a lot of intelligent work that went into the creation of this human form and facial features into this mountain. So then we look at a past thing, and we can infer that there is an intelligent designer. We can infer that because those are the processes that create faces in mountains today. Then we can say when we see faces in mountains at a past event, that some intelligent designer did that. That is called the principle of uniformity. Forces that act today to create things are the same types of forces that acted yesterday to create those things. So we want to apply this same principle to the causes of the universe. What caused the universe? Well, we've only got two possibilities. Either there was an intelligence, there was an intelligent designer of the universe, or there was no intelligence. that completely natural law was into the formation of the universe. So just like we looked at the sand castles and the stuff on the sand, just like we looked at the Mount Rushmore and at the unseen carving of Buddha into the mountains, we're going to apply the same type of rationale, reasoning, to an unseen event in the far distant past. Now, if you believe that a non-intelligence made this universe, you are trapped into a corner that makes you do a couple of things. Number one, you have to deny the second law of thermodynamics, which we talked about the last couple of weeks. You have to deny that law. There is, you are affirming that by completely natural laws, by completely natural processes, that somethingness came from nothingness. We have shown that scientists, even atheist scientists, agree that the way the universe came about is that somethingness came from nothingness. That's what the science determines. Okay? And if you do not believe in an intelligent designer, you are forced into this thing that somethingness came from nothingness. That's a really absurd position to take. And you believe that order can come from the chaos of a giant explosion. We live in a very highly ordered universe. And we're saying that this thing burst into existence in this giant explosion and became ordered. We never, ever see order coming from chaos. We only see the second law of thermodynamics, which is things go from a highly ordered state to a more disordered state over time. That is why you completely deny the second law of thermodynamics. And I will tell you, if you're a physicist, the second law of thermodynamics is one of those things that are bedrock laws. You don't deny the second law. Okay? If there's any law that's valid, the second law, they will tell you that is a bedrock law. We don't violate the law of thermodynamics. So, here's the teleologic argument. Teleologic means argument by design. Number one, every design has a designer. That is simply implied. If you see a design, it means there's a designer. That's just simple. That's first order. Number two, the universe has a highly complex design. Therefore, the universe has a designer. So, the argument from design has been recognized for a long time. Sir Isaac Newton, who we looked at his gravitational laws, said this as he discovered his universe. This most beautiful system of the sun, planets, and comets could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being. And it was William Paley who coined the watchmaker analogy. He said regarding anatomy and planetary astronomy, every watch requires a watchmaker. What he's referring to is this, is if you're walking along in the woods and you see a diamond-studded Rolex sitting there on the path, nobody would look at that and say to themselves, my, what beautiful nature. How amazing that the wind and the rain and the forces of the compression of the dirt could cause these diamonds and this highly complex set of gears and wheels to keep perfect time. That's silly. What you would say is somebody dropped their watch while they're hiking in the woods. Right? The point being is that if you look at something and it's got a very complex design with intention and purpose, you would say something put that, somebody designed it because it's designed, and somebody put it together. So this is where I think Jaleesa Rush came in like week one and started talking about this anthropic principle. Terry.
I just wanted to point out, I mean, that intelligent design argument is not allowed to be taught in schools, which baffles my mind.
Okay.
Because they say
So-
it's too religious.
Yeah, so there are those that would say that intelligent design is a pseudoscience. That is a false assertion. Because that's why I've gone through some detail today to say that the science behind it is the same science, it's the same process of observation and experimentation that goes into archaeology, that goes into the SETI research, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence research. It is the same process, it is the same science, it is the same analysis of information and data. Okay? I went through all that detail because I don't want somebody saying that, well, this is all pseudoscience. It's not. It's the same analysis, the same process, and same approach.
Right. Well, and if you could see a photograph of a DNA strand, for example, you would know that that's a lot more complicated than, than a sandcastle.
We just might see that in an upcoming show. So the anthropic principle refers to this fact that the universe appears very precisely tuned and designed to support life on Earth. And I want to illustrate this by going through a space capsule. So a space capsule is a highly designed and finely tuned instrument that allows life in a hostile space environment. And there's all kinds of stuff that go into a space capsule. But you've got to have all kinds of engineering to have just a very precisely tuned atmosphere. You've got to have just the right oxygen, carbon dioxide, atmospheric pressure in there to allow life to occur inside that capsule while it's floating out in space. You've got to deal with issues of water and heat and power and navigation. And a great illustration of how much design and how much we depend and how interdependent all these factors are is, of course, the Apollo 13 mission. So as you guys remember, and I think I'm going to try to do this without my notes because I want to kind of roll through this, so if I forget stuff, forgive me. But Apollo 13, it was actually, I forgot about this, but it was actually on April 13th that this accident occurred. So all of a sudden, the astronauts in there hear this big, loud bang, and they say, "What on earth was that?" They think that it's a joke, and they sit there and kind of yuck about it as they sit there and say, there's something going on here. All of a sudden, shortly thereafter, the oxygen sensors start going absolutely batty, going from almost none to greater than 100%. Sensors are going off, and then all of a sudden, not only sensors, but master caution warnings of the electrical systems are going off, and then there's this giant chaos, and we have the famous Houston, we got a problem. Now, this happened when the Apollo 13 mission was 200,000 nautical miles from Earth, heading away from Earth towards the moon. And they're losing oxygen, they're losing power, 2/3 of their fuel cells are dead, and the third one is depleting rapidly. So I want to use the example of Apollo 13 to look at what we're calling these anthropic constants. The anthropic constants are simply this. The universe looks highly designed to support life on Earth, and there are over 100 of these constants in our universe that if they were just slightly different, life would not be compatible here on Earth. So principle number one is oxygen. Oxygen comprises 21% of the atmosphere. If it were more than that, 25%, fires would be erupting all over the place and life would not be compatible on this planet. If it were lower than that, we would not have sufficient oxygen to do what is required in basic life processes. Basically, we would suffocate. So, Apollo 13, their oxygen's going. It's diminishing. And they have to figure out what they're going to do about it, and they have to figure it out quickly. Remember, they are heading away from Earth. They're getting farther away as they go towards the moon. And it turns out that on Apollo 13, a change in one constant suddenly affects a lot of the other things that are critical for life. Let me give you an example. The way that they were using, the way that they're getting power from the fuel cells, those fuel cells have hydrogen. You can mix oxygen and hydrogen and get water and power. So their source of power was these hydrogen cells. Okay? Their source of water were these hydrogen cells. If you don't have oxygen, you don't have a way to combine it, and you don't have power, and you don't have water. While they're losing their oxygen, they're losing their water supply, and they're losing their power supply. So just one constant, oxygen gets too low. Now they cannot have air, they can't have power, and they don't have water. So as you guys may know the story, they have to shut down the command module, and they move to the lunar module. Now, in this picture here, just to define this stuff here, this is what we would call the service module. This is where the explosion occurred, okay? This little cone-shaped thing on the tip, okay, this conical shape, that is the command module. That's where these guys are living and staying. And then this thing up here is the lunar module. The purpose of that was they were going to land on the moon. They were going to do a moon expedition there. So that thing is set up for two guys to spend several hours, 40 hours in fact. And so all three guys move into the lunar module because their command module is dying. They go into the lunar module where they are provisioned for two guys for 40 hours. And they've got now three guys living off of that for 4 days. So they shut down their heat. They turn off their command module to conserve power. And they go off the batteries and energy that is in the lunar module with the provisions for two guys for 40 hours that they're going to have to make last a long time. To make matters worse, one of the astronauts gets a fever and becomes sick, and everybody's getting dehydrated because they don't have enough to drink, and this affects their concentration. They now have no navigation and power to do the automated stuff, so they got to use their brains to navigate. They got to use their brains to make course adjustments. And just when they need to use their brains at their absolute peak is when they are tired, sick, dehydrated, and not at their best. So the plan changes here from a lunar mission to just how do we get these guys home. So they are going to do this thing here, and I have this here. This is their first. This is Earth. They've taken off right here. So they're about 2/3 of the way, maybe a little bit farther than 2/3. This is where that explosion occurs. Okay, right here they're now trying to correct themselves, and what they're going to do is they're going to go up around the moon, and they're going to use the moon's gravitational pull to go very close to the moon, use that gravity to pull them around and slingshot around to get them going back to Earth. Okay, and after they do that, they're then going to have to go this entire journey back to Earth, and they got all kinds of things to take care of. They have got to manually navigate. There's so much debris around the spacecraft that as the sun hits it, it reflects, and they can't see the stars adequately to do that navigation because there's all this debris coming from this broken gas that's jettisoning out in the debris that the reflection of the sun impairs their ability to assess the stars. So as they're approaching Earth, they have to look at the sun and the Earth and calculate their angle of entry, just basically looking out these tiny windows. Okay, so this is the Apollo 13 capsule, and they're looking out these little itty bitty windows, and they've got to sit there and have this highly precise calculation because they've got to enter at just the right angle between 5.5 degrees and 7.3. If you have a little bit off in one direction, you skip off the atmosphere and keep on going. A little bit too steep, and you will burn up because your descent is going to be too hot. Well, that entry into the atmosphere brings up anthropic constant number 2, the atmospheric transparency. The transparency of our atmosphere is precisely tuned for life. If it is a little more transparent, we would have death from excessive solar radiation getting through. It would be, the solar radiation would be too high. However, if it's too little, you need some of that solar radiation. You need it for heat, and if it was less transparent, we would have death from inadequate heat of insufficient solar radiation. And also, these are individual anthropic constants in and of themselves. The precise amount of nitrogen, oxygen, and carbon dioxide in ozone. If they are not each exactly what they are, life is not compatible here in this environment on Earth. So, anthropic constant number 3 is the gravitational interaction between the moon and the Earth. Now, the astronauts use the gravity of the moon to slingshot around it to get themselves on their trajectory back to Earth. But that interaction between the moon and the Earth are essential for life on this planet. Any more gravitational interaction and the effect on the ocean tides and on the rotation of the Earth and on the atmosphere would be too severe to allow life. Any less, and then you're going to have such terrible climatic instabilities that it would not be compatible with life. The climate would be so inhospitable that that life would not be possible. So, as these guys are coming home after their slingshot around the moon with our Earth-Moon gravitational interaction, we come into the next problem that they have to overcome. And that is that carbon dioxide begins to threaten the astronauts. They're up there in the lunar module, and they are literally poisoning themselves with their own breath. So they've got to go and they've got to filter out the carbon dioxide, because if it gets too high, we have problems. It's poisonous to us at too high a level. So they go into that command module, and they get the filters for this CO2 filtering process, and they go to put them in, and they're different sizes. The contractors for the lunar module that made it and the contractors for the command module were not the same contractor, and they didn't confer to make things uniform. They were different sizes, so didn't fit. So then, you guys, if you've seen the movie, they go and they start saying, how do we do a workaround? And they ended up using spacesuit tubing and plastic bags and duct tape. So it would be a true MacGyver would have been so proud. And the message, of course, is never leave home without your duct tape, because you never know when you might need it. And Apollo 13 is an excellent example of that. So anthropic constant 4 that we're going to look at is the atmospheric carbon dioxide levels. Too much CO2, and if you follow the climate change concerns of the day, too much CO2, too many greenhouse gases, and heat gets trapped in. Too great of a greenhouse effect would lead to too much heat that would become incompatible with life. Too low of a CO2, and plants cannot maintain photosynthesis. Now, I don't want to get too deep into the science of this, but in photosynthesis, when we look at a tree or a plant, we typically think of that thing sucking in its substance from the ground, okay? But the thing that the tree is sucking in from the ground is water, which evaporates, and some very minimal nutrients. The substance of the tree, the actual organic wood, leaves, branches, bark, and all that stuff, comes from air. It makes it out of carbon dioxide. What a plant does is he takes the carbon dioxide, he turns it into organic molecules that become the building blocks of that plant itself, and a waste product of that is oxygen. Okay? Well, we use the oxygen, and our waste product is CO2, so we live in a perfect symbiosis with the plants of this world. We create what they need to build themselves up. They create what we need for respiration in our own cellular respiration. So if our CO2 levels are not finely tuned on this earth, life becomes incompatible. So we carry on here, and we still have a problem, but we're working on it as the crew goes through. Now, the again, service module gets jettisoned as they approach Earth. Right about, so they're on their way back. Command module, service module separation. Right here, they jettison that service module that's been leaking, and they see for the first time what's really going on with this here, okay? And this is actually a good picture of it here, because for the first time in that approach to Earth that I showed you the time frame line on, they see this big old, this is supposed to be blue here, that this explosion blew out this giant panel in the service module, and that what in fact is leaking out is oxygen. Now, this explosion was pretty significant to blow out the side of the service module. And it happens back here. If it had happened just a little bit more forward, this is the command module right here. It would have damaged the heat shield, and they would not have been able to re-enter. So we're going to take a look at that, because all of a sudden now, as we are traveling through now with our non-damaged heat shield, praise God for that, and they are right here. The gravitational forces of Earth are getting greater and greater. They've got to look at the Earth and the sun, and they've got to just kind of manually, a little more, a little less. Hope this thing's right. Getting it just right. And they've got to get that sucker lined up perfectly. Gravity of Earth is pulling them faster and faster and faster and faster. So I just did this as a picture so you could kind of get a view. Here's the command module. Okay, this is where they're living in the lunar module. So they've got the command module completely shut down to preserve energy, and they're living off of the provisions in the lunar module. They've got to go back and forth to make their makeshift MacGyverized CO2 filters, and they get all that done. Now what they're doing is they are going back into the command module. They're jettisoning the service module. So now they'll just have their little space capsule here, and they're getting rid of their lunar module out into space. And when they go back in there, it is 38 degrees, and they go to their dead machines and instrument panels, and because it's so cold, guess what is condensing? Water. So they've got water dripping all over this, and they're about to power it up. They have no power, so they're going to operate with batteries. Okay, just some batteries that have the fuel cells are gone, so they cannot do their normal power-up procedures. They've got to not power up systems, and they've got to only power up critical systems. They've been working on that in Houston, so they give them a power-up routine, and they hope that things don't go zzz, zzz, and everything go dead with this water and condensation. Well, it works. The power-up process works. They leave most systems off, critical systems only. They've got no navigation systems. They are navigating purely by sight and mathematics and calculations. They're doing this through that tiny little window, saying, oh, little more, little less angle, okay? They've got this very precise angle that they've got to hit that atmosphere. Too little, they're skipping off into space. Too much, they're burning up. So they get all of that done, and this is just some really cool pictures of kind of what's going on with that at this very precise angle. and they make it. The gravitational forces pull Apollo 13 down, and let me see here. What was they are traveling. Oh, okay. So after the power up, the Earth's gravitational force takes hold, and they're about to be pulled to Earth. They reach speeds of almost 25,000 miles per hour. They're hitting that atmosphere, and they're going into Earth at almost 7 miles a second. 7 miles a second.
Gee,
Right.
it took less than a minute to go Cincinnati.
They're moving.
Yeah, think about that. That's crazy.
So the heat shields do not fail, and they don't have communications for there's a blackout period of time there. They don't have all their power. So this is just an amazing thing. So the final anthropic principle is gravity. The gravity that pulled them in there. Space. I want to point out that the spacecraft is a little oasis for life. I'm using it as an analogy for the little spacecraft that is the Earth in a hostile space environment. That Earth is finely tuned, just like a spacecraft is finely tuned to support life in a hostile environment. And that very small changes on Apollo 13 almost led to devastating effects. Very small changes in these universe constants would lead to devastating effects on our life. And it's important to understand that it's not just a few very broadly defined constants. We are talking very narrow and specifically defined constants that strongly point to a thoughtful and intelligent designer. There's more than 100 of these anthropic constants that are necessary to keep life on this Earth. If the gravitational force were altered by more than 1 part in 10 to the 40, and I'm telling you, 10 to the 40 is a number that you can't even conceive of, okay? If the gravitational forces were altered by more than just 1 part in 10 to the 40, and it has to be exactly what it is. The sun wouldn't exist, the moon would crash into the Earth or shear off into space. It's got to be perfect. And there are, as I said, just dozens and dozens and dozens of these anthropic. I'm just going to quickly mention a few of them. The centrifugal force of planetary movements is very precise to balance the gravitational force. So if the centrifugal force is a little bit more, you're going to be altering your orbits and going out into space. If it's a little less, you're going to be coming in and crashing down into the sun. If the universe were expanding at a rate 1/millionth more slowly than it is now, the Earth would not exist. Even things like our solar system is necessary. Jupiter is giant. It is huge. These little plumes that we can see through the telescope on Jupiter are caused by comet strikes. Comet, boom! And you can actually see that through the telescope. The comet fragments are larger than the Earth itself. Without Jupiter as basically a giant cosmic vacuum cleaner, catching debris because of its strong gravitational force, these things would be hitting the Earth and destroying it. Jupiter acts as a giant space vacuum cleaner, attracting the debris so that it doesn't hit Earth the way that you see it hitting Jupiter in this picture. So, and I've got a list of, I'm not going to go through these lists of these anthropic constants, but trust me, there's a lot of them. So what do scientists state? Well, they say that the universe looks designed. As we survey the evidence, the thought instantly arises that some supernatural agency, or rather capital agency, must be involved. Is it possible that suddenly, without intending to, we've stumbled upon scientific proof of the existence of a supreme being? Was it God who stepped in and so providentially crafted the cosmos for our benefit? And, the Bible tells us that it is the heavens that reveal God to us. In Psalm 19:1 it says, "The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands." Paul in Romans says, for since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen. Remember, Sir Isaac Newton looks out and says, this is a magnificent solar system we live in. It is so intricately and highly designed that it just screams of a God that created it. And this is what Paul is talking about. His eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse. And then in Isaiah, this is what the prophet says, speaking God's words. He says, to whom will you compare me, or who is my equal? Lift up your eyes and look to the heavens. Who created all these? He who brings out the starry host one by one and calls forth each of them by name. Because of his great power and mighty strength, not one of them is missing. You see, when we look out at the universe and when we look out at the cosmos, the Bible itself tells us there's nothing that you can look at to give you an idea of what God is like. But if you want the closest thing, look out to the stars. Look out to the heavens. It says, to whom will you compare me? Or who is my equal, says the Holy One. And then, asking that question, here's his own response. Lift up your eyes and look to the heavens. Lift up your eyes and look to the heavens. Now, there's an important anthropic principle in this itself. And we talked about this a little bit last week, that the average distance between stars in our galaxy is 30 trillion miles. And that exact distance is needed for Earth to exist in its present life-supporting position. Farther away affects the planetary motions and the motions of the galaxies to a point where life on Earth would not be possible. And so we look out at the heavens and we look at our solar system and we're going to say, how do we see God in all this? And this is what it looks like. There's Earth, but if you compare Earth, say, to Jupiter or Saturn or to the sun, it's a tiny, tiny little speck, even in our solar system. And if we take a look here at the sun, which is the largest, I couldn't get that arrow to go away. That was pointing at the Earth, the smaller one, but it's going to disappear in a second. So if we look at some of the other stars in our galaxy, if this is our sun, this is Sirius and Pollux and Arcturus. Now, if we take Arcturus and we kind of put it down to size, just so that we can get the scale of things, this is just a few other planets in our solar system.
Oh my God.
Stars.
Stars in our solar system, thank you. So,
Betelgeuse.
Arcturus, Regal, Betelgeuse. Betelgeuse is, if you look up at Orion, he's the left shoulder of Orion. That's Betelgeuse. Betelgeuse, the size of Betelgeuse, you could put our sun inside of Betelgeuse, and it's 93 million. The sun is 93 million miles from Earth. If you take the rotation of the Earth around the sun, all of that would easily fit inside of Betelgeuse.
Oh my God.
Easily fit inside, with millions of miles to spare. So, Antares. We'll put Antares down to size, and remember, our sun is a little speck compared to what we're looking at now on the scale of these stars.
It's like the cat pack.
So, So, if we were to hop in our space shuttle, which travels at about goodness gracious. See, there's a delay here, so I think I've gone back 1, then I'm back 3, and so I apologize.
You're fine.
So if we were to hop in our little spaceship at space shuttle speed, we talked about this last week, which it orbits Earth at about 17,000 miles per hour. If we had a space shuttle at the time of Christ and we had hopped in, and we're just going to go to the next closest star, and we left the day that Jesus was born, okay? Today, we would be 1/10 of the way to the next star. And this is the point that you were making, is like, well, if that's as far as we can get, how do we know what's out there? I mean, you're right. That the point is that the amount that we can explore through human space travel is teeny weeny. So if we think about the stars, there's 100 billion stars in the Milky Way itself, just the galaxy that we live in. And there are hundreds of billions of galaxies, each with their hundreds of billions of stars, which led Carl Sagan to say there are billions and billions of these stars. And if it takes us 200,000 years traveling at 17,000 miles per hour to get just from one star to the next, it is estimated that there's about as many stars in the universe as there are grains of sand on planet Earth. And if it takes 200,000 years to get from one grain of sand to the next grain of sand, how long would it take to explore that entire universe? That is why Isaiah said, to whom shall you compare God? Look to the heavens. Because that's about as close to an infinite concept as our minds can grasp. I want to get through this here and just go through that summary slide, which I unfortunately backed too far away from. Since the finite universe, and we learned from Mr. Einstein that all of time, space, and matter came into existence at the same time. Before that, there was no time. Before that, there was no space. Before that, there was no matter. And the fact that it all came into existence means that whatever caused that must be outside of time, outside of space, outside of material mass, to have nothingness come from somethingness. So whatever that first cause is, there must be something infinite outside of time, space, and matter that brought it into existence. And we know that whatever that first cause was, that it must be very powerful, that it must be eternal and immaterial. And in light of the anthropic principle, he must be extremely intelligent to have things precisely fine-tuned from this cosmic universe, the whole existence of which is finely tuned, of the billions and billions, for life on one little seemingly insignificant planet in that entire giant universe. So I would like to point out that these are precisely the attributes of God that we would read from the Bible. What I'm telling you is that the attributes of God from the Bible are not something that just come from the mind of man. They reflect the attributes of the first cause just purely from studying it from science. and applying scientific principles to the study of our universe and the study of our earth. And we're going to continue with design for life as our next step in this journey. Let's pray.